We have won freedom in areas such as VAT and excise duties. Well, that sounds pretty cool. That means the European Union's given back quite a bit of power. That means it probably means a treaty change to our withdrawal agreement until you read the small print.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Review with Nigel Farage. Nigel, let's start with the obvious one, the Brexit deal that's been announced. I've been reading the media reaction from all around the world and it's all contradicting and I can't make sense of it. I'm sure you can, so what's the real story?
Oh, you've missed the big picture. This is huge, enormous. What a victory. Can you imagine? We're now able, on cocktail sticks, to eat the same sausages in London and Belfast. This is the magnitude of the victory that has been pulled off by the Prime Minister. Do you know, it's really interesting. He invoked the name Windsor because it's a great historic place, as if to say this is a really big deal. He got the king involved, very unwise of the king to have accepted that invitation, in my opinion. You see, the king gets involved with deals and legislation at the end of the process. That's what the royal assent is all about. Not to say, hey guys, this is so cool, it's great. Not good, not clever. The performance he gave to the House of Commons, oh, they were rapturous. Rapturous. You want to see today's newspapers. Brexit breakthrough. This is the turning point for the Conservative Party. There's now a path open to win the next election. No Prime Minister has succeeded in negotiations in the way that Rishi has done. Isn't Rishi wonderful? And Tory MPs and cabinet ministers, and everyone's effusive, and it's wonderful. There's one slight problem. Detail. And what's really interesting is the British government have produced their nice, shiny 30-page report, but there's a Brussels document as well. And if you put one up against the other, you find some very interesting things. So, for example, we have won freedom in areas such as VAT and excise duties. Well, that sounds pretty cool. That means the European Union's given back quite a bit of power. That means it probably means a treaty change to our withdrawal agreement until you read the small print. Excise duty on alcohol and pretty much nothing else. And on VAT, some variability only on fixed objects, such as a heat pump on the side of your house. Everything else remains within the purview of Brussels. The stormont break. Now, it takes a devious civil servant to come up with a phrase like that. They tried to do it in the referendum, by the way, with an emergency break on immigration. Or the stormont break, where 30 members of the Assembly in Belfast can raise an objection to a piece of EU law, and that can then go to the British government, who can veto it. Well, that sounded pretty cool, but the small print says that only applies to revisions or amendments to existing legislation, not to any new legislation that might come in and affect Northern Ireland and their economy. And there's a promise that we make in it that this would only be used in exceptional and rare circumstances if the legislative change would lead to significant long-term damage. So the veto is not worth the paper that it is written on. And you can go through claim after claim that Sunak has made. And you can, I suppose, if you're being kind, say that he's over-egged the pudding. If you're being less kind, you can say, just like Boris Johnson before him, he simply isn't telling the truth to the people of Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And to all intents and purposes, the original treaty, the original protocol, everything absolutely stands. There are one or two slight differences in how in minor areas like food, we can make a very bad situation a little bit less worse. But there will still be paperwork to fill in for goods crossing through that new green lane. Let's see what happens. I tell you, it's a funny thing. But in October 2019, when Johnson went to renegotiate the May deal and cried, victory, oven-ready deal, I stayed up all night that night with my lawyer. We went through it line by line. I had 4 or 5 really key bullet points to make about my concerns, about what had been agreed, about how little it differed from what Theresa May had done before, including making clear that Northern Ireland effectively had been jettisoned, had been cut off. And you know something? Nobody, for one of the first times ever, nobody was interested in what I had to say. It appears in the modern world, just saying I've got a deal matters more than what's actually in it. So let's see what happens. I thought initially the DUP would accept it. They would say, look, it was so awful. This is better. It's not where we need to be. But with these promises, we can live with it. Now that I'm watching this unravel, I don't think the DUP can accept this. I don't think we're going back to power sharing. And whilst he won't have any problems in Parliament itself in getting this legislation through, because Labour will support it also, I also don't think the revolt in his own backbenches will be very big. I don't see it as a sort of a launch pad for Boris either. But the idea this somehow has turned around the fortunes of the Conservative Party. I promise you, within a few days, those nonsenses that you're reading in today's press will be for the birds.
It does sound like we haven't gone anywhere. Like this oven-ready deal is coming out of the oven and nothing has happened. And we're just where we are. But there's two sides with a completely different perception of what the deal says and what's going to happen next. So what does happen next, not just in terms of UK politics, but in terms of the standoff between the UK and the EU? Because, I mean, we had this issue with the EU not enforcing the deal as it was on certain topics. Now we've got a situation where two governments are presenting two completely different interpretations of the same deal again. So are we just going to keep on having arguments and debates and having to update the deal again in the future? Or are we going to have sort of, issues about small details?
I mean, Sunak wants this to draw a line under the whole thing, but I don't think it will.
Yeah.
But sadly, I think what will happen, and this is a bit of a gloomy prognosis, I guess, but sadly, what will happen, I think, is as we approach the next election and the inevitability of a big Labour majority, and I really mean this inevitability of a big Labour majority, we'll find ourselves aligning closer and closer and closer with all forms of EU legislation. We'll be told it's marvellous because we've got great relations with our next door neighbours. Well, of course we have. They'll be making the rules, we'll have no say, and we'll lose our competitive edge. The only hope for all of that is that the legislation that's been laid down to remove thousands of pieces of EU law actually goes through Parliament this year. I can see an absolute battle royal with the House of Lords on this. That's the one hope I've got, is that if we do that, we will achieve a degree of divergence. But I'm not even confident now that that's going to happen. And I think we're going to finish up in economic, in political terms, self-governing, yes, but in effective economic terms, copying the EU single market. And that's my big, big fear. And that's why I'm going to do my best to, raise concern over what the Windsor, what the Windsor Compromise means and its implications for the whole of the UK.
You've really given me hope there, though, for a second, about this idea that even if we only diverge to a small extent, if that divergence is a success, then from that point on, the initiative is very much in a favor of diverging further, right? And all of this agreement begins to look at that.
And that's why this job lot of wiping out EU laws is so very important, and we're gonna have to watch that very carefully over the course of the next 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, a few good success stories would be great. Speaking of Brexit, we have the vegetable shortage hitting the UK. A few weeks ago, we had some vegetable and egg shortages in Australia that my family and friends told me about, which was quite bad. We had the diesel petrol shortages when we spoke about that topic many months ago now. Of course, Brexit is the cause of all of this, everything that's gone wrong in the world. I'm sure that's your interpretation, but is that really what's going on?
There's no question. Brexit caused the frost in Morocco. There's no question about it. It's obvious. I mean, everyone knows that. The lunatics in southern England going into supermarkets with empty shelves where the peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers used to be, putting up stickers, blaming it all on Brexit. I think net zero's got a fair bit to do with this. A lot of this produce could actually be produced in this country in glass houses. The trouble is that there is a cost to heating them. And partly as a result of net zero policy, it's too expensive to do that. We've had bad weather in North Africa. But I think the bigger picture that's more interesting is one of the arguments in 2015-16 against Brexit was that the world exists on just-in-time supply chains, that anything that disrupted in some minor way because of customs checks the just-in-time supply chain would bring the automotive industry, for example, to a complete grinding halt. Well, what we've learned is the globalist dream of just-in-time supply chains, when it comes up against the realities of a war in Ukraine or bad weather in Morocco, suddenly breaks down and simply doesn't work. And I really think that is the big, big issue here. Those empty shelves are a symptom of just-in-time supply chains and the way the world chooses to organize itself between a dozen or so giant multinational companies. And that's why there is going to be, a change of politics across the West. And it's coming over the next decade, where the issue of self-reliance, the issue of national importance and national interest are going to come much more to the fore than they have been in the last few years.
And it creates the incredible incentive as well. If we did have cheap energy in the UK and we did have those greenhouses to an even greater extent than we do now, and we weren't reliant on Europe, which is shutting its greenhouses because of net zero, all the opportunities that grow out of this become immense. And I think part of what's going on is an incentive signal to people in the UK to invest in greenhouses and to invest in providing our own goods and services to ourselves, because we can't rely on others. And so hopefully that's another Brexit opportunity that we'll be talking about in 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, it also goes into the whole post-Brexit agricultural policy. I mean, right now you're being encouraged not to grow food.
Yeah.
You're being encouraged to grow flower meadows. You're being paid to do it. You're being encouraged to rewild, bring back beavers into English rivers. There's been very little thought from Carrie Johnson, her friends, the Goldsmiths, very little thought about this idea that maybe land is for producing food, rather than the reintroduction of exotic species in rewilded Britain. And I think that's going to go through a major rethink as well.
While you and I have been busy warning people about central bank digital currencies, it seems to me that a very related and similar threat in the 15-minute city or town has emerged, and there's a big furor about it. The same furor that I would have hoped for central bank digital currencies is playing out in this topic instead. So what do you make of it?
Well, 37 million of us have cars. 37 million of us use cars. And yeah, sure, if you live in a few central postcodes in London and you work in the civil service, well, those days of the week you go in, I suppose, you can live with a bike and you don't have a car, because actually having a car in central London is a blooming pain in the neck and costs money to insure and all the rest of it. With the rest of us, life is very, very different. And what we're finding is that cars are increasingly being used as a way, not just to tax us to blazes, not just to fine people who've never had a speeding conviction in their lives, but it's actually beginning to be used as a means of control. And there's no doubt in my head that 15-minute cities are all about controlling how we live and what we do, and keeping us confined, in our quarter of Canterbury or Oxford or wherever else it may be. And if we stray out beyond that, we're going to be fined effectively for doing so. I suspect, Nick, the truth of it is, along with digital ID and all these other ideas, I suspect the truth of it is what they would like is every car to have a black box in it with global positioning system data, and they'd like to track every single movement we make and charge us by the mile. That ultimately, I think, is where they want to go. But it is yet again, and we've railed against this in these podcasts, it is the ever-growing size of government and influence and control of our lives, and it is baleful.
Let's dig into that a bit more, because a lot of people see this as a conspiracy theory, the idea that government wants to control us. So we better try and explain this idea of control, because I think the fact that there's a fine for traveling outside your allocated area, I think in Bath they're even calling them cells. The idea that you can't travel beyond that, more often than you're allocated. That is the part that we object to, right? We don't really object to the idea that, if cities are planned properly, you don't need a car. You can go shopping locally and you can live your life locally. It's the idea that you will get fined if you don't fit into that mold. Yeah. That is the control that we're objecting to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the idea that, look, to be honest with you, if all of us could just walk to the shops and get our groceries and our, magazines and whatever we want, then that's great. And actually, I think as city centres become less retail orientated, as the big department stores close and everything else, I think it's likely that actually people will start to move into city centres, start to live more in city and town centres, and maybe that growth of small shops is actually going to come anyway. And I do see signs I've been to places like Rotherham where there's nothing in the high street because Meadowhall's open just down the road. Well, it's obvious that the central Rotherham should now be where people live, as opposed to where they used to go to shop. It's changing. So look, all of that sounds fine, but it is the fact that we are controlled, monitored, spied upon, fined. Do you know the embankment in central London has now got a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, and that applies 24 hours of a day. There are people who've been driving 50 years getting their first ever speeding tickets. And all of this is done as we're more and more surveilled, more and more fined, get more and more letters and demands. Has it reduced crime? Has it made our lives better and safer? No, it's brought none of those benefits whatsoever.
To me, the real story is that the government created these zoning laws, which prevented the 50-minute cities from being the natural way things develop anyway, and the counterexample of that being Japan, where you do have effectively 50-minute cities anyway without having to have any of these elements of control and constraint. Last but not least, I want to ask you about some of the inflation figures that have come out, because they are either coming in higher than expected or outright increasing in the case of, I think it was France and Spain yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday. What do you make of this? Because right now the markets are expecting inflation to go down quite rapidly over the next few months. If inflation turns up, it's going to be one heck of a shock.
Yeah, the markets are very buoyant and very high. I mean, the indices are at amazing levels. We've seen FTSE up through 8,000 and an extraordinarily optimistic, bullish start to the new year. We've always been somewhat skeptical about the current levels of the stock indices, but much of it based from the very same people who didn't see inflation coming in the first place are the very same people who said it's going to at least have halved come September or October of this year. And I would remind those who've watched this before, but to those who've never watched this before, there's a little old saying that I've got that I've had for a few decades that I picked up from a very well-known economist. And it is this: inflation is a disease of money caused by government. A massive excess increase in money supply ultimately is what leads to monetary inflation. Yes, there are shocks as well, but monetary inflation is what I'm talking about here. And history tells us it's always much stickier. It always hangs around for a lot longer than anybody thinks. And right now, of course, it's food price inflation that is having these big effects in France and everywhere else. And yeah, I think actually the global investment community is beginning to scratch its head a little bit and maybe think that the wild optimism of January might have been somewhat misplaced.
It reminds me a bit of the pandemic when we had the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Well, maybe we've had 2 years to flatten the inflation curve, and little do we know what's coming. Nigel, thanks very much for joining us. And everyone at home, thanks for watching.